So welcome everyone. As you enter the room, you are being muted. So everyone is being muted. Now, some of you, I can't see your faces, but that's okay. Maybe you want to stay in the dark for the moment. You haven't fixed your hair yet for the day or something like that. That's understandable. So, as we are recording this, I'm also going to keep all of the mics muted because when more than two or three are opened up, and the noise tends to get feedback, and then it's hard to hear, and we want to try and record this as clearly as possible. So I may just, if several mics get open along the way, I may just go back to the mute all again. So just be aware of that. You can unmute yourself by hovering over your screen with your mouse if you're on a computer, by touching your screen if you're on a device like a phone or an iPad. You can unmute yourself by touching that, and then you'll see a mute or an unmute. So you'll just click the unmute, and it will unmute you, and you'll be able to speak. There's also a raise hand feature, and I'm going to ask Brandon to talk about that.
Hey, everybody. So if you are on well, I think it should be pretty universal. So if you're looking at your screen, you should see something that says participants, and there should be a number 21 right to the top right of that with participants. If you select that, it'll pop open a sidebar, and there you'll see the option for raise hand, yes, no, go slower, go faster. So feel free to use any of those options. Again, that's going to be when you select the participant icon, and then from that, you'll have a little drop kind of sidebar area. And then if you do the raise hand, yes or no, because you keep that open throughout the length of this talk, you'll be able to see if somebody's asking a question or if somebody's having difficulty keeping up. So just a little tip.
Sorry, I'm still muted. I'm going to do my best to moderate this conversation and look for those hands. So don't lower your hand. Leave it up, because we may be in the midst of one of our presenters speaking, and then I'm not going to call on people in the middle of that. But if you have your hand raised, I will eventually get to you. Okay. And so, because we want to hear all of the voices today. There's also a chat feature, which you can click chat. And if you have a question along the way, let's suppose as I or as Bruce or as Brandon are presenting today, you have a question about something one of us says, or you have a question or a comment that you'd like us to consider as part of this conversation today, go ahead at any time, put that in the chat feature. I'm going to try and follow that as well, able to connect with you. So I'll try and moderate those and make sure that we get through to everyone, and we'll try to represent everyone today. If we don't get to your question today, please don't take offense at that. We're going to do our best to hear all perspectives today, and I want to make that very clear. All perspectives are welcome. Disagreements are welcome. You do not have to disagree with me just because you do not have to agree with me just because I'm your pastor. You don't have to do it. It's okay. We welcome all viewpoints, and they are all vital to us, because the only way we learn is if we listen to one another. And so I'm hoping that we can do that, and that we can hear one another, and that we can grow together in the midst of that. It's also, as Brandon, Bruce, and I were talking about today in preparation, what we want to make clear is today is not about politics. So let's not go down that road. But racism is not a political matter. It's a human matter. So we want to talk about racism in terms of its humanity, and there are peripheral issues to that. Some of us may consider them political, but they're not. And this is not intended in any way to speak on behalf of or against one or another political viewpoint or party or otherwise. So we want to make that clear as well. So those are my opening disclaimers at the beginning. I'm going to do my best to keep us on a time schedule today. We'll find that the conversation, I think, will go very rapidly, because it's one that will capture our attention, I hope. But I'd like to begin with a word of prayer, and then I'm going to start the conversation with some personal reflections. So let us pray. God, as we gather together today in this conversation regarding race and racism, we ask that you would open our hearts first and foremost to your Spirit, to move among us, for us to hear your voice, to hear your heart as our God, so that we might live as a people who understand the fact that you are the creator and sustainer, the life giver for all of us, for all people. And so therefore, Lord, help us to learn to be faithful by listening to one another and by listening to you. And so therein, when we do that, Lord, we may be able to be a people who seek justice in this world. Bless this conversation, bless this time, draw us closer to you through it, and draw us closer to one another and humanity through it as well. And we pray now for your wisdom in Jesus' name. Amen. So one of the things that Bruce and Brandon and I will be doing today is just talking about our personal story a little bit. And for me, that begins with, as I think about it, my upbringing, and I won't get real specific about any details because it's just not important that you hear all those details. But I would say that I was raised in a lower middle class, blue collar home. But in that home, and not just in the home, but in my larger family, historically, there have been at times some racist kinds of words used and comments used. And that was part of my upbringing throughout. As I think back through that, it probably shaped me, at least as a teenager and a guy in his early 20s. And I'll never forget an incident happening in one of my first jobs. Actually, my first job was being a paper boy, but beyond that, I took a job when I turned 16 of working at one of our local grocery stores. And I was on the truck crew in the back, and lots of stuff was said in the truck crew. But one day I was called to work out in the store. And as I was stocking some shelves, I heard someone speaking in Spanish. And under my breath, I said under my breath, "You need to learn the language or leave." And I remember my manager happened to be standing right behind me, and he heard it. And he took me aside and he had a conversation with me, and he said, he said to me, "You're not going to have a job really long here if you don't care for all of our customers." Okay, so I heard that message. I shaped up. I made sure never to say anything like that out loud again, but even though the thoughts continued in my mind from time to time. In my 20s, I would have said to you, "I'm not a racist." I would have said things like, "I don't see color. I don't understand what this is all about. I don't treat people differently just because of the color of their skin." And I would say that there was a growing shift in how I treated other people. And yet there was still a lot for me to learn. I remember in seminary then, working with a friend of mine who came from Kenya, from Africa. I became good friends with Simon Deritu and his family as they were here living in the States. And we spent a lot of time together while I was in seminary. And I remember early on meeting him. He spoke a broken kind of English, being from Kenya. And, sometimes folks like me, or sometimes I would think about, and this kind of relates to my comment from my working in the early days at a local grocery store as well, but I just thought maybe he wasn't as smart as I am. Now, I didn't think that. Like, I couldn't have said those words at that time, but I remember when I would explain things to Simon, I would take extra caution with explaining them, and I would be very deliberate in my speech, and I would be very condescending. And I remember one day Simon said to me, he said, "Kerry, we are not dumb people." I was like, "Oh, I guess that's what I sound like to you. I sound like I'm telling you you're dumb," which is exactly how I sounded. August 2000, I was told, after some probable kicking and screaming, that it was time for me to take Healing the Wounds of Racism, which is something that our denomination, the United Methodist Church, an effort that they led, and continues in a different form today. But it was a weekend away. It was, you had to go sequester yourself. You had to read all of these books. And I remember doing it, and I thought, why do I have to do this? Like, I've worked through this in my head. I'm not racist anymore. I'm good. I don't need this. And I remember after a long, intense day of study at Healing the Wounds of Racism, I was tired. It was about 10:30, 10:45 at night. And one of our presenters, whose skin tone was very black, she had gone out because she had something to do at her church. And when she came back at Simpson House where we were, the door was locked. Like, the front door was locked, and we were all standing at what was a side door. She had apparently knocked at the front door. Nobody heard her. She came to the side door, and we were all talking about our experiences that day and, how all that went. And the knock came at the door, and without thinking, because I was exhausted, I opened the door. I saw this black woman standing there, and the shocked look on my face told the story. She saw it. She didn't call me out. She saw it. I knew it. And immediately, I knew why I was there. Because I had to confront this racist attitude in my own heart. Fast forward within that was 20 years ago, folks. 20 years ago. I haven't done much in terms of speaking up about racism since then. That's why I talked in my sermon about silence. Because for me, that is my sin. That's where the personal level of sin takes its root in my life, of being silent. And I just couldn't be silent anymore when I saw the video of Derek Chauvin and the look in his eyes when he knelt on George Floyd's neck. And so it's time for me as a pastor to say, I need to speak. I need to stand up and do something. And so that's where I'm at. That's a brief history, and it is much deeper than that. There's much more in all of that history, but that's my heart. That's my passion. That's where I'm coming from in the midst of all of this. So I hope that you'll bear with me through all of this as we learn together. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and allow Bruce to talk about some of his story and some of his thoughts as he shares. So thank you, Bruce. Welcome.
Thank you, Kerry. Listening to you, I realize I've led a sheltered life, I guess. But today I thought I wanted to talk a little bit about a word that's become kind of charged. The word is privilege, and share some thoughts on that. You may agree with me, you may disagree with my perspective. But earlier this year, I was privileged to visit Israel and Palestine, and I use that word in particular because I think being privileged is not a sin. I say I was privileged to go to Israel because other people don't have that opportunity, and I did, so I was privileged in that regard. And when I got to Israel, when I got to Palestine, one of the things certainly that struck me was that issues of privilege and race are very prevalent in that part of the world. And in fact, I would say the issue of privilege is paramount in Israel today. And one thing that I learned and that I want to share with you, I think, is what I've already alluded to, is that privilege, in my view, in the abstract, is not in itself evil. All of us, I think, strive for our own advantage. It's one of the drawbacks of being a self. We're all inherently selfish. I mean, nobody asks to have their taxes raised. Nobody asks for a cut in pay. And if you're a Palestinian, you've never asked for your home to be bulldozed. So all of us want the best for ourselves. But how we respond, I think, to the privilege that we do enjoy is another matter. And if you'll bear with me, I want to paint a kind of a word picture for you to help illustrate that. Picture, if you will, a river in flood, and a town is swept away by the rushing water, and the people are being swept away with it. And many of them in the water, struggling to keep their heads above the flow. And at the same time, though, there's a few others who are standing on dry ground on the riverbank. Now, it's not the case that all the people in the water are evil or guilty in some sense, and all the ones on the bank are virtuous. Their relative positions are pure happenstance. And yet, I think we all agree that the dry riverbank is undeniably an advantageous position in relation to those in the water. Now, suppose I'm on the riverbank out of danger. At that point, I can respond in any of several ways. I can ignore the flood and just walk away. I can choose to defend my piece of the riverbank, pushing away all of those who might be reaching out, clutching at it for a handhold. Or maybe I can build a dike around my portion of the riverbank to keep those in the water from getting a share of my advantage. Or I can leverage the firm ground that I find myself on to reach out to those who are in the flood. So while being in a position of advantage is nothing to be ashamed of, I would say, abdicating the responsibility that comes with it is. I mean, that's really the crux of the parable of the Good Samaritan. How we leverage the resources that God places in our hands either justifies us or condemns us. And in the parable, it's the supposedly godly people who fail in regard to those obligations. So, shame on us if we allow that to happen in our time. Over in Israel, the Israelis' privileged position is embodied in a Jewish West Bank settler that we met named Hagi Ben Artzi, who notes that God himself promised that the land on which we were standing while we had our conversation was given by God to his chosen people. And sure enough, the Bible says, out of all nations, you will be my treasured possession, speaking to the Jews. Although the whole earth is mine, God says, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. That's privilege. That's a privilege that God gave to his chosen people. It's not evil, it's from God himself. But the problem arises out of what the chosen people have chosen to do with the privilege that God gave them. And Hagi insists that because God gave the land to the Israelites, they're justified in taking it from the current Palestinian residents by any means available. And that's the kind of conclusion we can reach when we pull a passage of scripture out of context from the Bible and quote it as our kind of philosophy of life. And yet the same God that offered that land to the Israelites and extended them that privilege also warned them throughout the Old Testament against selfishness and cold-heartedness. In fact, God's words, as recorded in the book of Deuteronomy, are this. He warns the Israelites, saying, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold increases, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud. That's what we have to watch out for. And he says to them, don't deprive the foreigner or the fatherless of justice. Don't take the cloak of the widow as a pledge. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, don't go over the vines again. Leave something behind for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. What God's saying here is that the privileges he bestows upon us are not ours to hoard. And in addition to being the stewards of creation, we are the stewards of God's bounty. And he intends for us to manage his bounty for the benefit of the neglected, the oppressed, and the poor, not just keep it for ourselves. And the very heart of our Christian faith is God's free gift of grace given to us who haven't earned it and don't deserve it. In fact, one of Jesus's most sobering parables tells about a man who accepted his master's grace but was unwilling to extend a similar blessing to others, and God's response to that action. So scripture, I think, is clear in documenting God's insistence that those of us who are fortunate enough to be standing on dry ground are honor bound to use our status to rescue anyone still in the water. Now, I know the expression white privilege has become charged, and that's unfortunate because any expression that becomes so emotionally charged ceases to become useful. So I won't quibble if you don't like the expression white privilege, but I do kind of insist that we as Christians recognize our Christian privilege. Because the church, just like Israel, has been ordained by God to be a nation of priests and a blessing to those who are hurting in the world. God has saved us and placed us on the riverbank. And I think we leave the Christian faith behind if we use that privileged position or don't use that privileged position and neglect those who are still in the water. So that's the way I take that word privilege. It comes with responsibility. So in light of all this, what can we do? Well, let me suggest something based on a previous experience of mine. This is something I think even the least of us can do, and yet I think it's absolutely essential if this conversation is going to go anywhere from here. And in fact, this particular suggestion comes not out of my experience in Israel, but out of the history of relations between white European settlers and Native Americans. A few years ago, Pastor Helen Adams, who's the lead pastor at Stamen, dreamed of holding a service of reconciliation with the local Native American population. And I agreed to participate in the planning of this event, which for various reasons never occurred. But for a while, we were working hard at it. And some of you may know, some maybe not, that Lancaster County was actually the scene of what has been called the Conestoga Massacre, which was the murder of 6 Native Americans by white churchgoers way back in the colonial period. And in doing my research in preparation for this supposed service of reconciliation, I stumbled upon a newspaper article about a similar event that was actually held several years earlier. And as I read the article, I was convicted of my own feelings. What I read was this. At that previous event, a local pastor had offered apologies for the past sins of the church and begged forgiveness. And in response, a representative of the local tribes said something along these lines. I tried to find the article again so I could read it to you, and I wasn't able to find it at this point in time. But basically what the Native American representative said when the pastor asked for forgiveness was, yeah, I'll forgive you. I'll forgive you for killing us. I'll forgive you for killing our wives. I'll forgive you for killing our children. I'll forgive you for burning our village down. I'll forgive you for taking our culture away from us. And as I read these words, I began to get angry over what at the time struck me as a needlessly snarky response to a sincere effort at peacemaking. And I found myself thinking, geez, if that's how you're going to be, then the heck with you. After all, I'm not the one who burned down your village, right? And then it hit me. That's when I began to understand how I'm a part of the problem too, or at the very least, it helped me to understand why real solutions are so elusive. It's because I always need to have the last word. I always feel a need to justify myself rather than to address the underlying problem. It's always about me. I insist on taking offense over somebody else's righteous anger. And what I came to realize as I monitored my own kind of feelings was that real reconciliation begins with me granting that Native American gentleman the privilege of giving me a good tongue lashing, even though I wasn't there when his people were murdered. And part of the process of healing for him is to have a chance to speak his mind unhindered, raw though his thoughts were. I mean, after all, I imagine that these thoughts had been weighing him down for a lifetime. And up until that moment, no one had given him the chance to speak. No one had offered to just listen. Just imagine how frustrating that must be. So I think the least that all of us can do is to put aside all of our judgments and take time to respectfully just listen. And if what we hear sounds harsh to our ears, you know what? We'll survive. And in fact, I would say if it leads to healing, bring it on. Go ahead, pour out your anger on me. I think that needs to be our attitude. Listening isn't the same thing as justice. There's more that needs to be done, but listening has to happen before we can have justice. And after all, it's the Christ-like thing to do. I mean, think about it. No one ever had enjoyed more privilege than Jesus Christ. And yet Scripture tells us he made himself nothing by taking on the very nature of a servant. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself, becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. I think that's got to be our attitude. If not physical death, if not death on a cross, we have to be willing to be uncomfortable for the sake of those who have a just grievance. I guess as Forrest Gump would say, that's all I have to say about that. So I want to thank you for listening to me as I went on my rant, and hopefully those thoughts will encourage some new perspectives.
Thank you, Bruce. And I'm going to turn it over to Brandon as well. And don't forget, if you have a question or a thought about something that Bruce has said or something Brandon's about to say, use the chat feature. Be sure to do that, or raise your hand, and we'll eventually get to you. Brandon, thank you. If you want to go ahead.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you, Pastor Carey, Pastor Bruce, and everybody. This is quite different for me. I don't think I've ever been in a position where I've been able to just openly talk about my upbringing, some of the things that I have dealt with in my life that have been race-based, whether positive or negative, but obviously the ones that I'm going to speak about are a little bit more on the negative side, but I feel have led to a great place where I'm at, where I have better perspective on things. So I want to say thank you again for the opportunity. I'm aware that a lot of you guys, I think, have known me well enough or long enough. I see some old faces on here. I see that have known me, and then I see some people who I've gotten to know a little bit more recently. So bear with me if you've heard some of it. But I think for me, the big thing that I wanted to kind of get off my chest is some of my background, some of the stuff that I have dealt with when it comes to race relations, but a sense of hope with that, and optimism that I can see coming from this discussion that is occurring all over the world. With Greg Floyd's death a little over a month ago now, obviously this has had an opportunity for a lot of people to reflect on how they view things, how they view themselves, how they see things that are either dysfunctional or not. And I feel like this is an opportunity for us all as a church community and as people, as Christ followers, to really reflect on how we see things and how we feel we could be effective and making people feel like they're a part of a bigger process here. So a couple things just to kind of point out from my background, for those of you who may not know me, I'm half black and half white. My dad is black, my mom is white. I have 3 younger brothers. I'm the oldest of 4 boys. And growing up, we grew up in Lancaster City. My mom pretty much raised us boys pretty much by herself. She was married for an extent of time, but that was not to a good guy in any way, wasn't really in the household. So for the most part, my mom worked 2 jobs supporting a household of boys on her own. Coming with that, growing up in the city, obviously there were a lot of struggles financially. Being born into a poor upbringing, obviously there's perspectives there that most people don't get to ever really experience. Obviously, we don't want that to be an experience people have to go through, but it does allow you to reflect later in life or as you go through it on different things that you may see. Growing up for me, my grandma, my mom's mom, she actually was racist. Before I was born, she was racist, avowed. She knew it. She didn't care who knew it. And she was very upset at my mom for being pregnant with me. And then through that process, I guess my grandma had told me this years later, as I got older in my teens, but she'd said the first time she held me after I was born is when she'd stopped having those thoughts and those feelings. So it took my birth to change my own grandma's opinion on how she viewed race. Growing up and living in a city, about 5th grade, I recall the first time I was called the N-word, and that was because of an altercation that took place between a bunch of kids outside of Buchanan Elementary, walking home with my brothers. I'll never forget it. They were goading me into a fight. At the time, that was just kind of how it was as little boys. And one of the things that they used to strike that chord was that word, and it was used in a very intentional way that hurt a lot. And then with that fight, I got home. My mom sees that I'm a little bloody, my shirt's torn and all of that. And I explained to her what happened. And there was a settling that came over her face when she realized what took place. Because first, she's irate, she's angry. Obviously, she's, why are you fighting? You know, I didn't teach you to get into fights, but I told her I was defending myself. And when I explained to her why I defended myself and what was said, there was a different tone and posture that came over her, one of sorrow and sadness. And I think for her, I think that was the first time we really had that discussion on race and what that word meant. My mom tried her hardest to obviously make sure that wasn't something we had to address as much as possible. Having kids of my own who are biracial, it's one of those topics that you're going to have to figure out at some point as a household how you go about that. That being the case, moving forward, we moved out of the city. 7th grade, I started out in LS School District, where I would leave and graduate high school from. Had Barb as a math teacher who helped me along the way. So I'm very familiar with people, even before coming to the church, who knew me growing up. But the aspect of coming out to LS was definitely different for me, because granted, you know, in the city at Wheatland, Buchanan, Fulton, the schools I attended, I would not be looked at as minority. It would be Caucasians that would be looked at as minority. But then obviously coming out to LS, you know, being one of maybe 10 people that were brown or black, it was definitely something that made me reflect and say, wow, this is a little different than what I'm used to. Moving forward into high school, I remember the first time, for those of you who recall, before cell phones, we had landlines, and we would use those landlines to call someone's house, and we would talk to that person. So if I wanted to talk to my friend, I would have to call their house, say, hi, Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so, can I speak with so-and-so? Well, there's a stigma, or for some people, there's an impression or a bias that certain people sound a certain way. To this family and to this mom, I sounded like I was of something else, skin color-wise. Well, the first time I arrive at this house, I'm with my other friend who they know. I've never met this parent yet. We were all there for a movie night and we were hanging out. I ring the doorbell. They live in this beautiful $500,000 house plus in neighborhood in LS. And as I go there, I ring the doorbell. The mom approaches the door and she lets me in. But before letting me in, she looks at me quizzically, like, who are you? And at that time, I had to say, hi, Mrs. So-and-so, it's Brandon. And I just remember the confusion that came over her face at that time, as she was not putting together the voice that she had put in her head and predetermined I look like, with me actually arriving at her house. As I walk into the house, it progresses where I'm walking into this beautiful house, this just gigantic house. I grew up poor. This is not anything I was used to. So I'm a little uncomfortable. So I distinctly recall like how I felt, my first impression, this discussion, meeting this person, all of it, just being out of my element. And as I walk in the main hallway and go into what's the kitchen to the left and the open layout to the right of the living room, the father is sitting on the couch watching TV, has his feet up. And I remember him looking at me even more confused than she did, just letting me in the house. And that's when I said, hi, Mr. So-and-so. And the mom behind me goes, oh, hon, this is Brandon. And his face of just confusion, like it confirmed what I had originally picked up on with that first interaction with the wife. And for me, I remember walking down to the basement thinking to myself, like, what was that? It was just such an awkward, I've never been through that, never experienced that. And it was just one of those things where I was just like, I feel a little uncomfortable in this. And I felt really uncomfortable after it was, kind of confirmed that second time with the husband. But they were the most loving people I could ever, and I still would count them as friends to this day. They obviously, I don't think in any way that they are racist, but I know a lot of times racial insensitivity can come out, whether we know it or not. And I think a lot of times, most people are not evil, most people are not bad, most people are not racist. I think what we find is that there may be insensitivities to certain topics, whether it's race, whether it's other misunderstandings we have of other people, and it's an ignorance that we just have to get over or learn or educate ourselves on. Fast forward to my professional life, joining the military, and I have two other instances, and I'll kind of segue off of that to the group discussion. I had to deal with race in a military perspective, which was so cathartic for me. It really helped a lot because I had two lives that I kind of lived, and I always have kind of looked at my duality in that aspect growing up. Growing in the city, being half black, half white, grew up in the suburbs, being half black, half white. But then going into military, and here the military does a great job of integrating everybody. They don't care what you look like. Ultimately, at the end of the day, if you're down in Iraq or Afghanistan, I need to know that you can be in a foxhole, downrange with somebody, and you're going to look out for whoever's next to you. So that whole the race aspect wasn't an issue, but it allowed you to get to understand people better, and for other people who didn't have exposures at all in their lives to understand and have perspective through the trial and brotherhood and camaraderie that comes from being in an environment that's stressful but meant to forge men and women. So I remember distinctly being at a gathering amongst other members, officers, senior enlisted members, and we're all having a drink and we're just relaxing after a day of work because it was a stressful day of work. And one of the senior enlisted members makes a comment and goes, well, we're talking about race and everything else going on. And they said, well, I don't know why me and a few other people of color at the table, Hispanic and Black. And he says, I will never forget this. He says, I don't know why you guys are upset. You guys have a Black president now. You're fine. What's the problem? And I just distinctly being so floored that he was so, like, it wasn't even a thought in his head that he had said something that was insensitive. To him, he thought all of the racist issues that this country has had for the 400 plus years post, the colonies, and then obviously through 1776 and on, to him, he thought that that was all out the window because we had a president who was elected that was Black. And I was just so blown away by that. And I said, well, okay, that's an interesting viewpoint to have. But at that time, we didn't feel like it was appropriate time to, again, there's a whole rank structure. So we felt that was not worthy of going into. Anyway, fast forward to my professional life. I'm a manager now, but a couple years ago, I was a supervisor. I was on a hiring panel. And as we were going through this panel, I was the only minority interviewee of 3 other male Caucasian interviewees. We had 4 people apply. The first individual was Hispanic from Puerto Rico, had a really thick accent. Had experience doing the job, laid out what he answered the 4 questions the best he could. We turn around at the end of it, we're doing a ranking, resume review, and scoring the criteria of that individual. I scored this individual in a manner that I felt was appropriate. After we talked to each of the 4 questions, the group kind of accosted me. They're like, well, why are you rating this guy so highly? This is the first interviewee. Don't be so kind. You need to be truthful and very, very honest about your scoring. And I said, okay, I was probably a little inflated for the first one. And anyone who's been on this call, who's been a part of that hiring panel, that first interview, sometimes you got to work yourself out a little bit through the scoring and you got to adjust as you go through. Well, the next 2 people who come through, white males, neither of them had any experience in the first 2 questions, and they openly admitted they had no experience with those first 2 questions. Well, after that second and third person, we do our resume review and ranking of our scoring and what we picked up from the interview. And here, I gave this individual 0, both of them, for the first 2 questions. They admitted they had no experience, and I didn't feel like there was a point to even, apply a score. Well, wouldn't you know, you would have thought I would have said something like just crazy in this room, because the 3 other individuals came at me and were like, well, he explained other aspects of background he had in a different IT specialization, so therefore that should be acceptable. We should be able to give him some points. And I was taken back by it after the first person they did that for. But then when it did happen again for the second individual the next day, I had to stop and I said, well, hold on a sec. I'm really confused here. I said, because you guys got on me for not giving the first individual, a low enough score. And yet these 2 individuals said they had no experience with the first 2 questions, but yet you guys found some way to justify there being some score that should be applied. And I straight up asked this, and I will never forget how this occurred. But I think I even told Christine about this after. Like, I distinctly recall this sticking with me for a while after. And I said, do you guys not notice the bias that is here? You have an issue with the first individual that you had difficulty understanding, but you didn't state that. And at the same time, you have 2 other individuals who said they had no experience, but you still found a way to justify giving them some points. I'm failing to see how I am any more wrong or right than any of you are for these candidates. And I will distinctly remember the guy to my left shifting uncontrollably in his seat. Just reading his body posture, I don't know if I upset him or if he was able to realize a little bit of what I was trying to say. And that shifting of his posture was enough for me to feel like, okay, I think I hit a nerve, but I think I got my point across. Last guy who got interviewed was a rock star. He deserved it. He was great, and he got the job well deserved. But the argument at the end came down to who would be the alternate selection. So in the event that individual doesn't take the job, who was our alternate? The scoring was still not accurate to where the first individual should have been the alternate. The 2 other individuals, they still had scored highly. And I said, this is not fair. That individual should still be in second place based on the scoring alone. These 2 other individuals, half the job they admitted they didn't know. I said, I don't know how you can justify this guy not being an alternate. And when I said it that way, they all seemed to understand. And I think they had a generalization at that point of, okay, that makes sense. But the point being, sometimes racism can come in different forms, and it's not even racism. Again, I think it's a lot of times it's racial insensitivity, and that's because of ignorance or for a lack of understanding that people may have of other people's lives. If you've never lived in that environment, if you've never had to struggle for things, if you've never had to deal with people calling you things, whether you're a different color, different orientation, whatever it may be, who you love, if you don't go through or at least have an understanding of that, I feel like at times you're going to lack that empathy. And I think a lot of times what we're doing in this generation and in this time of race is that we're replacing the empathy we should have for others for apathy. It's easy for us to throw an Instagram black picture up and say, hey, I'm doing my part, or I'm posting I'm against racism on Facebook. But at the end of the day, if there's no means or any kind of works coming from that, the empathy is what drives that. That truly is something you can't just read about, and you have to embrace it. You have to understand. You need to seek people out. You need to walk a mile in their shoes. And I feel like right now we have a great opportunity to take this topic and to make good, actionable results that can come from it. But it's going to take us navigating from the apathy aspect, taking the compassion and grace that we have, and then using the empathy and understanding where people are coming from, and truly trying to figure out how we can affect change that's effective. I think our church, I know we can do it. We have amazing people in our church, loving people, caring people with huge hearts. I can't tell you how many times me and Christine have come to you guys about youth camp or whatever it may be, and you guys always fill the need. So I know we have it in us as a community in Millersville to do that. It's just going to be a matter of how do we continue this discussion after this call, after this forum on this topic. Do we find different, actionable items? And again, Pastor Kerry, I'm kind of stepping in a little bit where you're going to go with it, but I definitely feel that some of my background, I hope, can help. Whether it's me telling you today, if you want to follow up with me, if you ever want to ask questions, I'm obviously available. I can't tell you how many people in the last month, and again, you can ask Christine. It's not bad. It's funny. It's exciting too. How many people have reached out and said, hey, I don't understand. Can you tell me a little bit about maybe your story or how you feel I could help? As a white person, or as a person who doesn't have any understanding of what it's like to deal with race or struggling with poverty in that way. So yeah, I know good will come from it. I'm really excited that we're having this discussion. I apologize for how long I went on, but obviously I look forward to hearing input from all of you. And I think you guys all are going to have really good insights that could help move the discussion along.
All right. Thank you, Brandon. I appreciate hearing some of your story as well. As so I was listening, a couple things came over the chat from one, Brandon, we all appreciate you speaking today. For another comment, Bruce, that was the first lesson I've learned from this. I need to listen, self-reflect, and be willing to learn from it. And then another one, so good, Brandon. Thanks for sharing your experiences. And a few more thank yous for sharing your story. And so it's good to do this. As you all were talking, a couple of things that I was thinking about. One is certainly that the lesson of listening and the importance of listening. And I think that's where we fail so often in our culture, is we don't take the time to actually sit down in a conversation where we're not thinking about what we're going to say next, but where we're actually listening to the person who's talking and trying to begin to understand from their perspective what their experiences are and how they are experiencing life. Another thing that struck me, Brandon, as you were talking, and that is that, particularly as you were talking about your experiences in the job interview, where you were interviewing for a position, and your colleague who was shifting in his chair, and I think about my own story. In my own story, I've just told on myself by the way that I've, the look on my face, the actions that I have, the words that come out of my mouth, because I get anxiety about what I'm feeling inside, whether it's fear of the other person or the color of their skin or whatever it may be, opening that door to one of my presenters and realizing, oh my gosh, it's 11 o'clock at night and I'm opening my door and there's a black person, and fear comes across my face. We out ourselves, we tell on ourselves. So fear being evident on our faces. Those are just some of the things that I thought about as you all were, as Brandon and you and Bruce were talking. I don't see any questions from anyone that has come across it. I don't see any hands going up. But is there anyone maybe who would like to jump in at this point? I'd like to maybe just open it up. Maybe you just want to go ahead and ask a question. So if you do, again, the little raise hand feature, if you open up participants, you can then you'll see across the bottom there that you can raise your hand. If you want to do that, that would be great. That would probably be the most democratic way to do it. But if you can't get there and you just want to wave at me, I realize I can't see all of your faces. If you just want to wave at me, I can also call on you. Anyone have a thought?
I see Sharon's question. I can take that one. Sharon says, thank you so much for sharing your stories, your experience. I'd be interested to hear how you define and I can never say that word right, differentiate racism versus racial insensitivity. And again, I am in no way I'm not an expert on this in any means of the matter. From my own experiences and seeing it from other friends and family, I would say racism is usually something that's coming from a purpose of hate, at least something that is meant to be woefully hurtful to others, whether it's said to their face or it's said behind the internet, on Facebook or on whatever it may be, on Twitter, whatever that is. So I think racism can come across in a different form where it's distinctly done. I mean, let's take it for what it is, right? So the Ku Klux Klan. The KKK is not registered as a terrorist organization or anything like that, but that is a hate group in this country that prided itself and started, in a sense, during Jim Crow South of taking slaves and basically keeping them under an oppression in the South. That is a form of hate, lynching of other people. Where insensitivity comes from more so, and my thought would be, I could be insensitive by making an off-collar joke that I heard somewhere that I thought was completely innocent, but in reality, it can be completely hurtful to somebody else who would hear it. And my intention was never meant to necessarily hurt somebody, but just something I found humorous, and I could put in my, compartmentalize in my head that was just a joke. That was not meant to be hurtful. But in reality, that insensitivity can actually hurt just as much as blatant racism. So I think sometimes, when we have a bias or a blind spot about something, I think we had an insensitivity there that we need to educate ourselves on, or to at least, again, be more empathetic to. And I think that would probably be my own distinction of how I would say, take those two topics of whether it be racism itself or insensitivity. But that's a good question. What would you think? How would you how would you take both of those terms, or how would you see those? The mute button is elusive, I know. Oh yeah, you can type that too. That's fine.
Brandon, your story about hiring reminded me of another story. I don't even remember where I heard this, but I think it speaks to how sometimes we can be racially insensitive without having the slightest clue that that's where we're coming from. And it was the story of a trial that was being held, and there were two lawyers, and they were going through the jury selection process, and there was, I forget the details, but there was, race was involved in the trial. So they were trying to find a jury selection, of jurors who were not racially prejudiced. And one juror was up being questioned by one of the lawyers, and the question of racism came up, and this woman said, I am totally not racist. And as an example of that, as proof of that, she said, well, I just, not too long ago, a black man came to my house looking for a place to stay. And I said, sure, I'll put you up. You can stay in the barn. And the lawyer, and she said that kind of, proud of herself, that this is how, open-minded she is. And the lawyer simply said, if he had been a white man, what room would you have put him up in? And the way the story went was, she thought about it for a second and broke down in tears because she realized for the first time in her life she was a racist. And the way the story ended, the lawyer said at that point she would have made the best juror, because she had self-examined and she had realized for the first time in her life that all these assumptions she made about herself were incorrect. And as I was listening to your story, it was just, you said that look on the face of one of the other interviewers. Maybe that's, was that kind of realization shining through that, what, there were reasons that I graded that candidate the way I did that I didn't even realize at the time. But now that my eyes have been opened, thinking of Carrie's message today, now that my eyes have been opened and I can see kind of what's been going on inside my own heart, I realize that I have been at least racially insensitive at that point, and maybe a little bit more in that case.
Thank you, Bruce. Sharon, I'm not sure why I can't get your mic unmuted. I've tried on my end as well, and it just doesn't seem to want to unmute for me. So I'm not sure. I apologize. Let me just try one more thing, and this is going to unmute everyone. So just bear with us for a second. If we could just try this and just let Sharon talk. Oh, your audio is not working. I gotcha. Okay, and I see that now in the chat as well. Okay, not to worry. So we'll go on. If you have something that you want to respond with in the chat, go ahead and type that in there. There's a couple other questions that have come up, though, that I want us to address, and this is directed at you, Brandon, as well. It's from Sarah. Brandon, thank you for sharing. Are there things you see we could do and improve upon when it comes to Sunday morning worship, welcoming others in our outreach ministries, et cetera, to be more sensitive and welcoming? So, Brandon, if you could address that.
No, that's a good question. I think this is one I know me and Christine have talked about at length in the past. So as you guys are aware, we make it a point to really tackle in ministry together, serving at Pocono Plateau. We both met there. We both accepted Christ there. It's a big part of who we are in our walk, our faith journey. So that being said, we also have connections through other areas and communities in the tri-state area. We have a partnership that we have with one of the Shiloh Baptist churches in Chester, that obviously it's a Black congregation, and we are invited down on a regular basis to meet with them, be a part of some of the youth's lives as they continue to grow. We have relationships with all of them now, and it's always striking to me, going to that service or even going to my family's service, growing up, even now at Brightside in the city. There are definitely distinctions between the different services. I'm not really sure what could be done per se that would bridge that gap, because anything that would be done, I think sometimes are going to come across as half-handed. Like, they're not going to come across as being 100% genuine. It's going to look like, hey, and I'm not dismissing mission trips or anything of that nature, but that, hey, I'm going to go to the continent of Africa and I'm going to go somewhere over there and I'm going to serve for 2 weeks and I'm going to take pictures and look at me helping. And then what usually happens with that picture or that description, it always comes across a little tone deaf in the aspect of, hey, I'm over here doing my part, and then you come back home and it's like, well, what are you doing to continue on with that serving and that outreach, whether it's in another country of people of color or not. So I'm not sure what we could do per se. We're kind of limited based on the demographics of the Milledgeville community. And that's not a bad thing. I'm not saying that we don't do enough there, or we don't feel like we have diversity amongst our church body, but I'm not really sure how we would really approach that. I think we have a lot of outreach and ministry that do things in the community, whether it be Cancer Care, the Loft, the Hub, youth camp. There are so many different avenues that we serve in different areas where we can reach people of color. But at the same time, it is kind of stark, right? I can look when I'm sitting in a service on Sunday and look around and say, okay, it is, that's what it is. I don't know. I really don't know how we would go about that. I think that's a great question. I'm not sure if there's a perfect answer there. I think that's going to be something we all individually will have to address ourselves, whether we invite friends or family, people we know in the community, to the service. I'm really not sure. That is a good question. It's one I still have yet to figure out for myself when I do ask the question to myself, an answer to. But yeah, I'm not sure. It is a good question, though.
I was gonna say, I guess I usually worry when I see like a family come in or something that's new to our church, and I just want them to feel welcome. And then I think, when they look around, and do they feel that? Do they feel that they're welcome? Do people come up and greet them and so forth? And the other issue I have, which when I did stats for the conference, you'd have to list out how many Caucasian or European Americans how many African Americans, Polynesian, whatever. And, under different pastors, it might be like, well, we think we have this many of this group or that group. And I was like, until you go and do a survey and everybody says what they want to identify as, like we did have one or two in like a new membership kind of form fill out Native American, and so I was like, okay, if that's how they're identifying, I will put that down for the stats. But I was like, until we all, because I was like, what do you look at as far as what someone themselves personally identifies as and what percentage, because I know Marshall and I, we thought his family had some Native American in its background. And so it was like, well, what do we, I'm not going to self-identify other people. And so that always bothered me. And I know the conference wants to know, what the congregation makeup is, but it just always irritated me that I had to fill that out.
Well, you brought up a good point. So would something, with your question, would it be more advantageous for us in our congregational makeup when it comes to diversity? Would it make more sense for us to just get involved or back certain initiatives as a church body? Like, for instance, there are groups that are out there fighting for certain, equalness in certain areas. I mean, like there could be things that we just do ourselves that naturally putting ourselves on the front lines. And I'm not saying specifically when it comes out to like protesting per se, but when we're getting involved with, nonprofits that are out there trying to effectively educate others and bring awareness and making those connections, if we're seeing that we're out in the community and we're making those inroads, I would think naturally because of that, if the discussion occurs and allows for someone to say, well, who are you with? Or, are you guys part of an organization? We say we're part of our church. And they're like, oh, okay. And maybe then they start coming back or they check out our church service. I almost wonder if it should be a reversal of what we always kind of want to think about when it comes to church. I feel like a lot of times we think, well, what can we do in our church to make the change? And I think sometimes it's not necessarily what we can do in the church, it's what we can do in our community. Like, the more we're out there, the more we're doing stuff, that's going to speak for itself. And then people are going to want to ask, and then they're going to have that curiosity. So I don't know, maybe it would be something like that. Maybe it'd be a partnership of some kind that would be beneficial.
Well, I think too, like growing up in my church over in York County, we had a sister church, it was an AME church. And so like, I think it was in the summer months, but we would have our pastor and choir go to their church, their pastor and choir would come to our church. And so just even in doing that, having different music or a different pastor on that Sunday is more, educational, I think, for both congregations to see a different music style or preaching style and so forth. And, so that to me opened the door that, one Easter, I was like, I'm going to go check out their church for the Easter sunrise service, and I was the minority in that congregation on that morning, but it's just, I think helpful that way, even when I went to Temple University to go check out other churches, other styles of worship. And so maybe like you're saying, partnership, if we had a sister church, we could look at what their outreaches are and we could join together to help support those. And by doing that, build relationships and learn from each other. I don't know, just an idea.
Not to take it away from Cheryl or Karen, I saw they had their hands up where Cheryl has it and Karen did. But Sarah, to piggyback with what you're saying, I would say just from this generation and younger, from the 33 crowd and under, I would say the big thing that you're going to find that's genuine in how we can serve or help to bridge the gap of racism in any form, it's going to be the action aspect, right? I mean, if we say we want to make a partnership or we will say we want to be a part of something, I think until we have enough trust and proof of us doing the work, I think that's when you then start seeing some of that inroad occur. I think a lot of times people think that if we put again, this is not belittling anything like this, but we put a panel together, Methodist Church, we're known for conferences and meetings and, and just, and that's okay. It has its point. It has its place. It's effective for various reasons, but at times I think you just got to get out there. You just got to do something. And this generation, we would rather see you make results. You may mess up. We're not trying to get perfection. We're just trying to make progress. So, we can't look for the perfection right away. We got, it's going to be bumpy. It's going to be a long ride, but just get out there, do stuff, be involved. And that in itself, I think is going to lay the inroad that we would be looking for in our community in the church. I'm not sure if it was Karen or Cheryl first, but. Yeah.
So go ahead, Cheryl, do you want to, Cheryl and Dave?
Yeah, Lumina, and we're involved in Kids Night, and they're looking to do some summer projects with the kids in their neighborhoods, and I'm sure we could get involved that way. They've all been given masks. We would have a mask on to do some outdoor activities with Lumina Kids. And the prison ministry, when they're allowed to come back out and help with the construction, they're looking for people to provide meals, which is another way we could reach out.
Thank you. And Karen?
I was going to say something along that line. Can you hear me? Okay. What we do around Christmas time with Jacob and going down to the church and help with the families down there, it's eye-opening for a lot of people. I work in the city, and I think what it is experiences for everybody. It's all about experiences and what you know or what you don't know, and understanding one another. And if we could get more involved with helping others, not only in our own community, but in, our closest city, which is Lancaster, and continue to do more work and try and get more people to help out and form more relationships, I think that would be helpful.
Just to give an example of that, when our latest team of volunteers went down to New Creation on Farnham Street to serve with Kids Night, the first night we showed up, everybody said, well, you're new faces here. Where are you from? And we said Millersville Community Church. And like 4 faces lit up at once and said, you're that church that sends the youth group every year to do the Christmas program. Thank you so much. People notice when you're out there doing things. And if anybody wants to get involved, we've got several opportunities ongoing. I would invite you to get in touch with me. Kids Night is an ongoing thing. We can use more volunteers for that. You can work with the kids. If you're uncomfortable working with kids, we can use kitchen help. But that's a great way to get outside of our comfort zone and yet not real far outside the comfort zone. So you can kind of get a taste for a different sort of cultural experience than you might be used to without it being too scary. We also just recently, I've been working with the Lancaster Office of Church World Service, and we're looking at providing some, we're probably building a new partnership. We're starting out kind of lightweight by just putting together some what they call welcome bags to welcome immigrants into the community. But I'm hoping that over time there'll be enough interest involved that we could start providing mentoring services and counseling and one-on-one work and that sort of thing. So there are a couple of ways that we are already kind of involved in the sorts of things we're talking about, and certainly we can always, go in new directions too. But there's some initiatives that are kind of in the early stages that, with some input, if we really want to, put legs on these discussions that we're having and really be out there in the community doing some good works. There's already some groundwork laid that you could be a part of and help contribute to.
The immigrant situation is not just in Lancaster. Prior to the COVID thing, we actually had a tentative evening through the Penn Manor School District to assist with a dinner for immigrant families within our own school district. So it's just not.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of other notes that came in from the chat too. First of all, Brandon, you got a shout out for Pocono. But from Kathy Rowley as well, I think in line with the conversation that's happening right now, she says that I'm part of a group of Penn Manor teachers who have started to meet and have discussions on racism in education and how we can change the language and the environment. It's just starting, but everyone's very committed. And I appreciate that, Kathy, because I do think part of the reason for, at least in my mind, part of what precipitated this for me is we have to start somewhere. And I think it begins in conversation where we are able to listen to one another. And I do think that having maybe a group that can kind of help to keep us motivated and move us to do things is important. And in that conversation is doing something, because I can tell you, you heard, like I told you some highlights of my story today. But in that story, if you heard me, I'm racist. I have racist tendencies that are part of my being, that are part of, whether they were, part of my nurturing, if you will, that grew up within me, that are still there, and I still need to work on those. And so I need to listen. I even realized that there was something that I did in my sermon today that came across perhaps to some. Some may hear my sermon today and hear something that happened there, or see something that happened there as racist. Now, I'm not going to elaborate on that too much right now, but it's something that I continue to work at, and I need others to help guide me in that journey. And so conversation is so important in the midst of that. And I see your hand is up, Kathy. So if you want to go ahead and unmute and say a word.
Just to follow up on what you said, one of the things through, we had a wonderful article about 10 things that teachers need to know about racism. And it actually isn't just teachers. Everything that was in it just can go towards anybody. But like you said, sometimes, like I said, we've got to be open-minded, and we are going to say things that you don't realize because it's been so ingrained in us for so long, and not realizing that something that we might say until maybe even after we say it could be misconstrued as being racist, even though it wasn't intended to be. That we've got to be open-minded, and if somebody calls us out on it, we've got to be willing to say, oh, wow, I didn't see it that way. Thank you for telling me. I got to learn from that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Brandon.
No, I was going to say, Elena, I thought she had a question, I think.
Hey, so my name's Elena Hart. I think some of you in here probably know me. My family and I grew up going to Grace. Now I live across the country in LA, but Grace is still super important to me. So I thought I'd jump on the call and wanted to hear Brandon speak as well. Brandon, thanks again. That was great. So something I think that's super important, just to give some context, I was living in New York for 2 years before moving to LA, and I am the minority at my church. I'm very blessed to have a church that's very diverse, and I think just in the wake of all the Black Lives Matter protests and the situations that have been going on with the police brutality, I think my church has really stepped forward and said, like, we're not going to stand for this. And they've made a huge commitment to really educate our congregation and to say, like, these are really important resources you should be reading, you should be listening to, you should be watching, like really good documentaries, really good pieces of literature. And I think one of the really cool things that they've done is they've decided to support Black-owned bookstores and order a lot of, different really important resources for us to continue to learn and understand what people, our Black brothers and sisters are going through right now. Because I think as a church, that makes us better, and that makes us, more empathetic and more loving to, what's going on right now. And it also kind of opens our eyes, and, it makes us better. So I would love to know if, Grace has any ideas around how to, make that commitment and how to continue learning.
Go ahead, Karen.
I want to comment on what both Kathy and Elena said. Thank you both. I think I've told a couple of you, but I work at McCaskey, and I've had 2 assistants who are Black, and I never thought I had a racist bone in my body until they pointed them things out. And some of them, the way they pointed them out, I was just taken back by it. Like, what are you talking about? What do you, I didn't get it. And like I said, it needs to be, like, I was glad that they were open enough to share that with me, because that must be really hard for them also. So it took some very heated conversations sometimes, but we were all Christians, and we worked through it, and I think that that's what it's going to take. And I think what Lena just said is what I was thinking, is we really need to educate. I think our kids, the younger ones, are so much further than we are as older people, because the way we were raised. And it's kind of ingrained in you and you don't even realize it. So like Megan has been to Pocono Plateau, and I told Brandon that, you know, some of her best friends are Black, and I'm just, you know, she has just such a different perspective on things, and I'm just so thankful for that, for those opportunities that she was able to go and be with people of different race and different color. So I really think what Elena was saying about putting some things in, maybe like the 10 things that Kathy was talking about that you need to know about racism in our newsletters, or, you know, put it on an email blast, and people will read, and it'll take time, but people will hopefully come around and start to understand, and we can have more conversation. And it is all about education. You know, we, just like anything else, all of us, you know, have different perspectives on things, and we just need to educate.
I have a question. So Kathy, you brought up the fact that you're part of the Penn Manor teachers. Is there any consideration being given, I forget what school I read this about, but I read it recently, that I guess some of the schools are considering banning the Confederate flag with some of the students attending school, whether it's on the back of cars, pickup trucks, things of that matter, the displaying of it. I've always found that would be something that could be a part of the discussion in regards to how that comes across, or how that's being used in a public discourse setting, and how that could be something that causes a lot of divisiveness in the community, especially at an early age in schools. Yeah. Is there any talk that you're aware of where maybe that would be something that could be an initial response to saying, hey, you know, we'll take a foot forward here and we'll tackle one of these topics, whether it be the flag or anything else for that matter?
No, but I mean, I don't, like I said, we're just getting started, but it's something that's a really good point that would be something to bring up. Now, where I am at, I don't see that, but I can definitely believe that it is elsewhere. I'm at Hambright Elementary, and we're a very diverse school. So we don't see that as much where I'm at, but yeah, that's a really good point.
I guess that would be more for the high school, and I probably should have asked. Obviously, as a teacher, you could be anywhere in the range of schooling. Yeah. But yeah, I remember just growing up in LS. I remember distinctly, you know, that Confederate flag and American flag being on the back of pickup trucks, and, you know, that being such a big deal, and then on the belt buckle, and then on the front of the car, and then splattered everyone in the back. You know, it's just one of those things, right? I mean, that you would think that would be something that's non-controversial to everyone to get behind. I mean, Mississippi just today, the House approved the legislation to actually remove the Confederate flag from the state flag, and the governor said he would support any legislation passed to him. So it sounds like, for the most part, obviously NASCAR removing it from their, you know, the tracks and any of their participants, and then just overall some of the statue aspect of, you know, hey, we have these monuments, you know, like celebrating these individuals that literally fought for, you know, the enslavement of people, you know, or erected statues in a way of commemorating, you know, and sometimes people say, you know, it's a heritage thing. And I was like, well, you know, understood, you know, museums probably would be the appropriate way to really reflect on heritage and have people who are more educated and understanding of the history and can, you know, educate others better. But anyway, it just seems like that would be one of those topics that if I mean, for me, I would love to see our church back something and say, hey, listen, this is where we stand, or this is what some of us, but I also understand this is the world we live in, right? Anything, gosh, even wearing a mask is considered political. So at what point do you know, sometimes you can't win, right? So.
Exactly.
I see Mary Berger waving at me. Mary? I can't unmute you either. I'm not sure why. Oh. We had it there.
I'm unmuted. Okay, so Brandon and Pastor Carey, I'm sitting here wondering if I should share this little story, but I'm going to because it was a hurtful, painful situation. And I knew some of you may know this story. I've shared it. An experience at a McDonald's where my grandchildren wanted to play in the playground. And this was a couple years ago. And when they played in the playground, there was already, and I don't know what's appropriate, African-American or Black family that was in the playroom, taking up quite a bit of the area, but mostly on the one side. And in the tunnels were their children that were just kind of a little wild in the tunnels. So my granddaughter went up into the slide and stuff and came down, sat next to me and said, crying, that kid just kicked me in the face and he had his shoes on. And so there was one of the sons was sitting down the seat with earplugs on, listening to music, and he immediately got up and ran over to his mother and said, that girl called my brother a black boy. And the woman came storming into my space, in my face, and said, your daughter called my boy a black boy. And she said, you are racist. You are so racist. And I said, she was like right here. I said, I'm pretty sure my granddaughter said that boy, not black boy, but it caused, it was hard to know how to handle it other than as a Christian to try to assure her that the black word was never used. But we ended up, there was no conversation that could have been had by that. So we had to end up just going out and leaving. But I thought, that was frightful. That was frightful. And I'm not, of course, I'm learning a lot here. And I think the education of how to respond or how to, I just think, Carrie and Brandon, education for our congregation is going to be absolutely necessary, because we did grow up in Millersville. And if there was the only Black family that I knew that was in Millersville was on Landis Avenue, went to Penn Manor, the kids went to Penn Manor, and that was it. So we haven't interacted, even though I've worked with Crispus Attucks Center for many, many years. But I think we need to educate. We need to keep the conversation going. That's me.
And just in response to that, Mary, a couple of things that come to my mind. I don't know if these are the right answers or wrong answers, but just thoughts that come to my mind. So I'm not looking necessarily to answer the situation, but I think about the experience of the family that you talked about who was playing, who happened to be Black. And I think one of the things that I'm learning, at least that I'm learning, is that when you've heard racially charged or racially denigrating language thrown at you all of your life, you can tend to hear some words. And so if your grandchild said that boy, and it was heard as black boy, then it's whatever is heard is the thing that grabs you. It's the thing that, because you're already emotionally charged up about what you heard. And it's going to be very hard for you to have it proved that, like, this isn't what was said. And the thing that stands out to me is actually NASCAR was mentioned, and the driver, Bubba Wallace. And perhaps all of you have heard the news stories. It's been all over the news about the noose that was found in his garage stall. And the FBI was brought in to investigate, and it turns out that that noose had been there for some time, that it wasn't actually placed there for Bubba Wallace. But I heard lots of debates about, because I follow sports and I watch sports shows and all of that. And so I heard lots of debates about that particular incident. And there was one particular debate that dealt with, was it right for NASCAR to jump on that so quickly and say that someone put a noose in this garage to make a statement to Bubba Wallace about, to make a racially charged statement, or should they have waited until the investigation happened? And the one debater was saying, no, they did absolutely the right thing, because in a culture where so many people are hurting, you have to, at least if you are the sort of the employer or the parent person, who employs them, you're the person who is supposed to be protecting them. This is your stall as NASCAR. This is your garage as NASCAR. You should be protecting them. Then you better immediately understand where they're coming from and come out with a statement about that. The other guy was saying, no, they should have waited. All it does is give credence to the people who say all of these stories about racism are a hoax. And so here's just one more of those hoaxes. See, it's all a hoax. And I tend to think that the first guy is right, because what he's saying is we have to start listening and say, I think I understand where you're coming from. And in understanding that, I deeply apologize for what was felt and what was heard in that moment. And I think that goes a long way to healing those wounds of racism that are so deep within us. There was no hoax about that thing, but what there was a misunderstanding. But in the midst of that, to come alongside and validate the feelings that Bubba Wallace as a driver may have been feeling and some of his crew may have been feeling as a result of that was absolutely the right thing to do. And I think that's one of the places where we need to go. We get so defensive about, well, it's not me. I'm not that person. I don't say those things. I don't think those things, and we come off with the flip answers. And I can tell you, folks who I speak with, who I'm trying now to listen to, they're saying to me, we are tired of being told that our feelings aren't real, that our feelings aren't valid, that our experiences are made up. We're tired of being told that. We're not going to hear that anymore. So I took that maybe a little bit away from your story, Mary, but just going back to that family, I just think about what they may have been feeling. At the same time, I understand what you're feeling as well in the midst of that as a grandmother who loves your grandchild and who knows your grandchild didn't say that thing. So how do we not get angry at one another in the midst of this? And I think it comes back to listening. So speaking of listening, we are at 2:25. We're almost an hour and a half into the conversation, and I want to honor our time today. And we have a lot more that hasn't been dealt with here, and there's lots of other questions, and so I just want to try and run through these quickly if I can, and then we'll come back with a plan to follow up. Okay. And I would welcome any of you who are listening today, who are part of this today, to be part of that plan. And so just really quickly, I wanted to address something that's been here for a while, and that's going back to Sharon. I know we couldn't get your mic on, Sharon, but just wanted to follow up on addressing the, how we might see a difference between racism and racial insensitivity. And, just we all have some thinking and studying and learning to do around that. I think I would think of it this way. I see racism, if we were to divide those things, which I'm not sure they're so easily dividable, but if we were to divide them, I would say racism speaks of literal violence done to human beings, and racial insensitivity is our unwillingness to listen. And so we just continue to throw out those, racially insensitive comments, and we really don't care about it. That's all lumped into racism for me, but it's how I might address that. Sharon also asks, are there any author book recommendations for educating ourselves, podcast? Kathy Rowley, I know you've been reading a book lately. You might want to throw that one out for us.
I am reading White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. I've also started reading a book of I do this all the time. This summer, I read more than one at the same time. the Bible and racism, because I wanted to know how racism, connects with the Bible. And I'd have to take a look. I don't know offhand the article that I read. It's also a podcast that I listened to. That article that I was telling you about is also a podcast. I could probably pull it up on my Spotify really quick. Podcasts. Where'd she go? It's 10 things every white teacher should know when talking about race. And her name is Angela Watson. And the podcast is called Truth for Teachers.
I also have a really good book recommendation I'm reading right now. I dropped it in the chat. It's called The New Jim Crow. It's Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, and it's by Michelle Alexander. It's really, really good. And a documentary that kind of touches on it and goes along with it is called 13th, and it's on Netflix, and it's absolutely incredible. I recommend both.
Thank you. Excellent. I do see those in the chat, and the chat will be saved, so we'll be able to pull some of those in there. And White Fragility is listed in there as well from Diane Duell. I did remember Diane. I think you told me that you were reading that as well. I'd forgotten that. And what else am I seeing here? Watched Just Mercy recently. That's from Sharon McElhenney. And so Just Mercy.
Excellent movie.
Thank you. And I know there are others as well. I have a couple that are on my list for this summer, if I get to them. And if I could just pull those up really quickly.
I keep thinking too about all the discussions you see on social media and so forth. And for me, I just am constantly reminded by God that the human being is greater than, is more important than the statue, the graven image, the idols, the flags, the symbols, the pancake mix. That it's more about our brothers and sisters, our humans, than it is about the things that we try to hold up as idols in our lives. That those are what's hurtful. So that's just one thought I had recently.
Thank you. And one that is on my list to read that I haven't read yet, but I am really looking forward to taking some space. So I'm going to read it when I'm on vacation, so I'm not distracted. And that is a book by James Cone, C-O-N-E, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. I'm looking forward to reading that. I've heard some colleagues and friends telling me for years now that I should be reading that. And it was recommended to me now, finally, one too many times, and now I've got to read it. So
I started reading that 2 weeks ago. It's really good.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm looking forward to reading it. So just thinking about that. And there are some others as well, but these are things that we can do as well. And answer, Diane, you had put a question in the chat about what do we do next? And I think that's kind of where we are in this conversation today. Folks, first of all, we didn't get to 1/10 of what I was hoping we would get to talk about today, but that's good. One of the things that tells me is that this is a big matter for us to continue with. So, with that though, I'm going to be meeting with Bruce and Brandon post this meeting and just briefly talking about, what's our next step. And then we'll begin to develop a plan. If you want to be part of any plan that we develop, just send me an email, send me a note that says, hey, please don't send it through Facebook or I probably won't get it for 2 weeks. But if you send it to me by email, that would be great. text me on my cell phone. That would be fine too. But those are the best ways to get me. So
Maybe we look at, just a quick idea, maybe we look at things like movie night or documentary night with discussion to follow, or we do like a reading club or something where we try to educate and set different goals like that for along the way to learn. I think once we educate and learn and become more empathetic and passionate about things, then the idea of getting behind something will come naturally, that we'll know how to do that better.
Yeah, absolutely, Sarah. And we got a thumbs up there from the Horsts, from Lisa Horst. So thank you for the thumbs up in the screen, and we will we'll follow up on all of this. I really appreciate the spirit within which we had this conversation today. Again, there's a lot more that's out there, and I've gotten some notes throughout the week, one in particular that outlined a number of thorny matters around this that people are really struggling with that we haven't gotten to today. But again, we'll get to that. So thank you all for your time today. I really appreciate this. And if it's okay, I'd like to just ask if Pastor Bruce would close us in a word of prayer today. And he's there. There he is. Bruce?
Just turning off my air conditioner and unmuting me so that we can do this without interruption. Sure, let's go to our Lord together now, if we can. Father, we thank you for your presence among us. I thank you for the turnout that we've had here today, for the vulnerability that's been shown by a number of those who spoke up, by the genuineness, by the sincerity that we've heard, by the willingness to share thoughts and ideas, by the willingness to ask questions. And we thank you for being with us as we struggled to come to grips with some of these questions. We've got a long way to go, Father, and we just want you, we ask you, we need you to walk with us, because as this meeting comes to a close, this is not the end of things, this is merely the beginning. As Brandon has said, we're not going to be perfect as we strive to address these issues. Father, we, each one of us, are fallen people. We are all, to some extent or another, a part of the problem. And so we ask for your forgiveness for those times when we stumble. But we are just so grateful that you are our loving Father, that you are a forgiving Father, that you will walk with us, that your word has much to say to us, and that you've given us resources. Father, we are a nation of priests. We've been given a degree of privilege by you. Help us to use that advantage that we've been given to effect some change in the world around us. Give us courage, give us wisdom, and give us the resources we need to have an impact on a world that right now is hurting and struggling. And Father, to the extent that you walk with us and we are able to achieve a few small victories here and there, we will give you the glory. Father, we pray for all these things now in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you all. I really appreciate your gift of being here today. Blessings to all of you.